So finding the audacity of equality in the stories of immigrants and refugees. This is Suni Lee right here. It's a photo of Suni Lee. And if you don't know, she's the Hmong American gymnast who won the gold, the silver, and the bronze medal at the Olympics last summer. And here's a photo of her community in Minnesota celebrating the gold medal win. Now, Suni's story reminds me that the American dream is alive and well. From her family's refugee story, her dad building the balance beam for her in the backyard because they couldn't afford to buy one, to her family selling noodle soup in their garage because they didn't have enough money and they needed to send her off to competitions. And so that was their way of raising enough money to send her off to competitions. And the fact that 60% of the Hmong American community in Minnesota lives in poverty, this story reminds us all that when immigrants and refugees realize their American dreams, we all feel like we've won the gold medal. Suni's story also reminds us that we need more of these stories, not only for these communities that have long lived in the shadows of America, but we need these stories for all of us. And although Suni's story is 1 in a million, there are countless other stories worth being told, and many of them right in your schools. Okay, my name is Don Vu, and I'd like to share with you my story. I also want to talk about how we can amplify the stories and voices of all students, especially our immigrant and refugee students, or multilingual students. And before we start, I just want to say I'm honored to be here with you today at the Multilingual Learner Summit. Thanks to my Vietnamese brother from another mother, Tan, and thank you to Dr. Carol Salva and Dr. Katie Toffel for having me, 3 people who put this awesome event together. So honored to be here. I want to start off by sharing with you a photo here. Newspaper clipping from the Manteca Bulletin from 1975. That's my hometown newspaper, and that's me right there and my younger brother. And we were literally poster kids for the more than 100,000 Vietnamese refugees in America at that time. And I included this photo in my book, Life, Literacy, and the Pursuit of Happiness. And I know that we have a couple of these books to raffle off. I don't know how we're going to do it, Ton, but I trust that we'll figure out a way, and I'll sign and send them off to you. Unless they're like out of the country, then Ton can send them to you. But we have a couple of books to give away. And throughout this book, I include these prelude chapters that introduce the main ideas of the book. And these prelude chapters become somewhat of a memoir about my own refugee experience and my childhood growing up in Manteca, California, and my experience in schools as a teacher, as a principal. And my hope in writing these prelude chapters is that after reading this book, you, the reader, will have a better understanding and a connection to my own refugee story. And with this connection, my hope is that you, the educator, the teacher, the principal, the librarian, the paraeducator, will go back to your schools and feel inspired to connect with your own immigrant and refugee students. These prelude chapters are meant to be personal because, in my opinion, that without the personal connections, our work in schools is only half complete. I also write about the work we did at my last school, Tom mentioned it, in building a culture of reading for all kids. I outlined 6 conditions of culture that need to be addressed when doing this work. And I was lucky enough to be principal of Barrett Ranch Elementary School near Sacramento, California. And we worked hard to ensure that we surrounded our kids with lots of books. And we worked hard to ensure that we surrounded our kids with lots of diverse books, diverse collections of books, and books that inspired them to dream about the world around them and the world ahead of them. And we worked hard in providing our students with something that I never had growing up in Manteca, California, in the Central Valley of California in the 80s and 90s. Okay, so here's a photo of me in the 80s, and that's me in the 2nd grade, I think. And I was told that bowl cuts were pretty cool back then. So that's what my mom told me. So that's me, Manteca, California. And it was very homogenous town back then, small town, and it was mostly white. And during elementary school, my brothers and I were the only Asian American kids in school. And I joke to some people that Manteca was so white when I was growing up that my house was Chinatown, right? I was an English learner, a multilingual learner. I remember being pulled out for small group ESL instruction, which I was very grateful for. And I also remember that I didn't learn much about Asian Americans, let alone people of color, right? Except in history, during that one time in history when we learned about World War II, Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor, right? That one paragraph where every kid in the class would look back at me and stare and as if I had something to do with the history. And I think it was safe to say that my education was pretty whitewashed. And I don't think it was much different from anywhere in America during that time. And as a result, I think I was pretty whitewashed, wanted to fit in. Culturally, I didn't. And so I did everything I could to change that. I remember when my friends would come over, I would hide the rice cooker. Anytime we were out as a family, I really didn't like to speak Vietnamese loudly with them just to attract more attention. And so it wasn't until college that I realized that the world was a much bigger place, right? That there was room for other stories and there was room for my story in the world. And it wasn't until college that I realized this thing called the Audacity of Equality. So what is the Audacity of Equality? To answer this question, I have to give full credit to this one guy. Now, I can't see the chat, but if you know who this is, put it in the chat. He's gotten more popular in the last few years. If you said it's Hasan Minhaj, you're right. Okay, this is Hasan Minhaj. He's a comedian and a political commentator who was on The Daily Show and had a series on Netflix called Patriot Act. Okay, and this is Hasan. I don't know if you can see him. That's him in the blue shirt, but that's his dad right there. I'm going to go back to 9/11. It's about 20 years ago. And in his Netflix special, Homecoming King, Hasan recalls a hate crime that he and his family experienced just after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. In his hometown of Davis, California, not too far from Sacramento, where I live, Hasan and his family were having dinner and they hear the windows of their parked car smashed after a threatening phone call from a stranger. And he and his dad run out to the front of the house and survey the damage, and his dad immediately began sweeping. He began sweeping up the glass and conceded that this was a new reality for Muslim Americans, right? And they just had to accept it. For Hasan's dad and so many other immigrants of his generation, for my dad, my mom, there's an immigrant tax to pay for living in America. Right? If you weren't born here, but if you want to benefit from everything America has to offer for you and your children, you have to bow your head sometimes and accept certain things in American life, such as racism and inequality. And in their minds, there's always a trade-off. The price you pay for the American dream. Living in America meant that you will always be a second-class citizen. Now, Hasan, on the other hand, was enraged at being a victim of a hate crime, and I'm gonna let him tell you how he felt. This is a clip from Homecoming King. I hope you can hear the audio.
But for me, like a lot of us, I was born here. So I actually have the audacity of equality. Like, I'm like, no, I'm an honors governor. I have it right here. Happiness. All men are created equal. Says it right here. I'm equal. I'm equal. I don't deserve this.
The audacity of equality is the belief that as an American, you have the right to freely pursue the American dream. You possess equal rights and protections no matter where you were born. You don't tolerate being mistreated. You don't put your head down and ignore injustice against you or others. But unfortunately, right, for immigrants, for many immigrants and refugees, the audacity of equality has yet been realized. And this is the reason why skyrocketing cases of hate crimes and violence against Asian Americans. Many of the silent victims are elderly or recent immigrants because they, like Hassan's father, can see that this is a price they are expected to pay for living in America. Let's go back to our heroine, Suni Lee. A few months ago, she was a victim of a hate crime after winning the gold, the silver, and the bronze medal for this country. She and her friends, all Asian American women, were waiting outside for a ride outside a restaurant in LA, and they were pepper sprayed by a passing car, and they yelled racist slurs at these women. So it's still happening, but it's different this time with this new generation, right? They're realizing the audacity of equality, that they belong and that they are equal. And she spoke up about this incident and it made headlines. And possessing the audacity of equality is why you see the next generation of Asian Americans, from activists to athletes, stand up and say, this is our America. We will no longer accept inequality and injustice. And I'm going to stop right here for 1 second to acknowledge one thing, right? Some of you may never have had to think about this because being an American and being equal has never been an issue, right? No one has ever questioned your status or your rights. No one has ever told you to go back to where you came from or question any part of your identity. You were born with the expectation of equality, right? And this is how it should be for all of us, right? Of course, for many refugees and immigrants, this isn't the case. And so the question is, how do you instill the audacity of equality in your students as educators? That's our question. We'll talk about this now. I see there are two things that we can do and we must do to instill the audacity of equality in our students. One, share the stories of immigrants and refugees. And two, tell the story of America. So let's look at the first idea. Share the stories of immigrants and refugees. In the chat, who recognizes this person right here? If you said it's Dr. Tawny, you recognize this person as Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop. Yeah. And she made popular the idea of windows and mirrors and sliding glass doors in children's literature. And she once said this. I think it's cut off on the right-hand side, so I'm going to read it to you here. She said this: when children cannot find themselves reflected in the books they read, or when the images they see are distorted, negative, or laughable, they learn a powerful lesson about how they are devalued in the society of which they are part. So if we're serious about empowering all of our students, we need to ensure that the stories they read in our schools or libraries are a reflection of them and their importance in society. And unfortunately, we haven't been doing a great job at this. According to the Cooperative Children's Book Center, this is data from 2020, recently, children's books published recently contain 12% Black characters, main characters, 1% First Nations, 10% Asian American Pacific Islander, 6% Latinx, and 72% feature main characters who are white, animals, or objects. You can also think about the other groups of kids who are also underrepresented, students with special needs, LGBTQ. Here's the thing, here's the thing, there's good news because there are more diverse books being published every day. Books available to us like this book, Dreamers by U.E. Morales. Imagine reading this book to a student who is a new immigrant searching for belonging in this country. As you read and talk about this migrant story and the gifts the characters bring with them, consider the impact on a child when they see themselves reflected in a book that celebrates immigrants. Right? They just become a little bit more visible and feel that much more significant. Books can also be used to address social and emotional needs as newcomers find comfort in the stories of other young immigrants and refugees who are in the same shoes they're in. This book right here, The Name Jar by Young Suk Choi, may be just the right book for a newcomer who's anxious about their American classmates being unable to pronounce their name. Right? Books can heal, or at least start the process of healing, some of the trauma, big or small, that newcomers experience while transitioning to a new life. And in every case, when a student sees that their stories are important enough to be shared in school, they will begin to realize the audacity of equality, that they are important and valued members of this great melting pot. This is Malala Yousafzai, and she's the youngest person to win the Nobel Peace Prize for her work in promoting education for girls throughout the world. And she wrote this book, Malala's Magic Pencil. If you've read it, then you know how great of a book this is. We did a whole school book study with this book. And I remember one day, I remember reading it to a small group of second graders, and I remember a little girl listening to the story and stroking her hijab as I was reading it. And she was beaming, and I took this opportunity to engage her. And I said to her that she was wearing a beautiful hijab and asked her how she felt about the story. And she said, "I'm so proud that Malala is wearing a hijab like me." And what struck me was that I knew that years before, many of our Muslim families, this is right after 9/11, were sending their girls to school without their hijabs for fear of prejudice and discrimination. Right? They didn't complain. They just figured that giving up part of their identity, part of their culture, would make their kids feel safer in our schools. And that day, I was reminded that books can change the world, right? Malala's Magic Pencil changed it for that little girl, and hopefully for her family, and hopefully for the rest of their lives. So, books about immigrants and refugees, what books do you know? Go ahead and put that in the chat. I think it's kind of important. Well, I think it's really important. Every time I do a webinar or attend a webinar, I learn just as much from the chat as I do from the speaker. So share with your colleagues, what books do you know that are impactful, that can have a positive impact when sharing with your students. Put it in the chat. I can't see it, so I'm going to try to get that transcript, because I would love to know myself what books you have. So, in addition to telling the stories of immigrants and refugees, we need stories to teach children from an early age where immigrants and refugees fit in the history and future of America. Tell the story of America. It's undeniable that immigrants and refugees have significantly contributed to the success of this country. Since the beginning of this century, nearly 40% of American Nobel Prize winners, 40% in science and medicine, are immigrants. Immigrants or children of immigrants have founded almost 45% of Fortune 500 companies, such as Apple, Tesla, Wayfair, bringing in more than $6 trillion in revenue. And on the other end of the economic spectrum, migrant farm workers, most of whom are immigrants, have been classified as essential workers during this pandemic. and are deemed critical to the food supply chain by the Department of Homeland Security. Books can be shared. Books that can be shared in classrooms include nonfiction titles that highlight the people who have made significant contributions to this country, those who make America beautiful, people like these farm workers. Harvesting Hope. It's a picture book by Kathleen Kroll. It's about the life of Cesar Chavez and his fight for humane and fair treatment of farm workers in California. His work changed the way we grow and harvest food, and in doing so, changed California and American history. And I didn't learn about Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers labor strikes until college. I didn't learn in a school in the Central Valley where much of this history took place. Students can explore the lives and contributions of 15 extraordinary immigrants who helped shape America in Home of the Brave by Brooke Kahn. From Carlos Santana to Madeleine Albright to Isabel Allende. Kids can learn about the great Americans who were once new immigrants to this country themselves. When immigrant and refugee students see themselves in the stories of Americans who have made a difference, a positive difference in this country, they can start to see their own potential. So let's talk about some takeaways. What are 4 things that you can do tomorrow to help your students develop the audacity of equality? I wouldn't say tomorrow, just probably because most of you are on summer break, but when you come back, right? What are 4 things you can do? Well, first, you can read aloud a book about immigrant and refugee experiences, discuss with them the issues and challenges immigrants face. Wishes by Monty Van. There's only 70 words, but it describes the loss of home, the loss of family when searching for a new place to live. And I think this book would be great for elementary school, middle school, even high school, because it's very poetic and the themes are can go very deep. A book that I enjoyed recently, Our World is a Family, by Mary Whitehill and Jennifer Jackson, introduces to students why and how people become refugees and how we can help welcome refugees and immigrants in our communities. And this, I think, would be great for young students, elementary school age. And for the older kids, Refugee by Alan Gratz, story of 3 young refugees from different times in history and how their stories are connected, how the themes of refugees and immigrants are connected throughout the decades of history. Put on an event in your school, your classroom, or library that is focused on the contributions of immigrants and refugees. Students can research extraordinary citizens and present on the person of their choice. And I don't know if you can see that, but that's Albert Einstein. Kid doing Albert Einstein, and he was an extraordinary refugee. Find a valued member of the community who is an immigrant or refugee and invite them to be a guest speaker in your classroom or library. For your immigrant students, they will love seeing a visitor who they can relate to and have connection with. And for your non-immigrant students, it's an opportunity for them to hear the story of someone with a different perspective. And I say tie it in with one of the children's books that you're sharing or with a social studies unit. Speaking of social studies, right? Enrich your social studies curriculum. Broaden your social studies curriculum and ensure that different perspectives, especially those who have been traditionally left out of American history books, are included and taught. There's nothing controversial about this, at least there shouldn't be, right? Your libraries can supplement the curriculum to ensure that American history is inclusive, multicultural, and alive. And remember that the message it sends to students when we decide to leave out their part in stories, in histories, right? So if you're learning about the Japanese internment or World War II, write to me, this book right here, Write to Me by Cynthia Grady is the perfect book for showing a personal side of history. Right? It's a true story about Clara Breed, a librarian who writes letters for several years to her Japanese American students who were sent to the Japanese internment camps. It's a story of loyalty, of friendship, of courage, and it adds a rich perspective to this chapter in our history. George Takei wrote this graphic novel, right? They called His Enemy. And this is his firsthand experience of the internment camps, the internment prisons. And it was recently banned in Pennsylvania until students protested and got it, and several other books, off the banned list. It's a primary source. Again, it's a firsthand account of his experience. It's an account of the tragic yet historical time in our history. But people were afraid of sharing the story because it obviously discusses a systemic failure of our government and our society. But the kids knew better, right? The students knew better, and they fought for it. So tell the story of America, the good and sometimes the bad, a story of America that is inclusive and diverse. A few years ago, one of my former students, Jennifer DeBortley, she left this book on my desk. It's A Different Pond by Bao Fee. And she put a little Post-it on it and said, hey, Don, I think you'll like this book. And, she was wrong because I love this book. And I remember reading the story about this Vietnamese refugee family and a day in their life in America. And I remember how much I loved reading the story. I identified with it and saw my own family struggle to survive in this new country. I love the tight-knit family in the story that made it possible to overcome everyday life in America. This book was a mirror for me. And after decades of being in schools as a student, as a teacher, as a principal, I finally understood what Dr. Bishop meant when she discussed the importance of sharing the stories of all people, right? Of seeing the impact and the impact that books have when you see yourselves in the stories shared, the positive impact. And this book, A Different Pond, would have made a positive impact on this kid right here. Because I grew up not believing in the audacity of equality. Like I said earlier, there weren't too many stories about people like me when I was growing up. We weren't in the history books, not on TV, not in movies, not in books. So in a way, we were invisible. In a way, our story was not important enough to be shared in society. Like I said, the good news is things have come a long way and we still have much work to do. But more and more diverse stories are being published every day. They're being told. And our job as educators is to share them so that our students can feel visible and valued. And I'm going to tie this up and go back to the quote by Dr. Bishop. Right? When children cannot find themselves reflected in the books they read, or when the images they see are distorted, negative, or laughable, they learn a powerful lesson about how they are devalued in the society of which they are part. The stories we tell and the stories we don't tell all reflect our values, and the kids learn the lessons either way. And I'm going to close with Suni Lee again. A prominent member of the Hmong community recently said about her impact on the community and the importance of her story as an Asian American and daughter of immigrants and refugees, this person said this: stories in the media, popular culture, and school history books do not represent our complete history. Complex cultures and rituals. They rarely speak to the resilience as a people who survived genocides and have had to fight against COVID-19 and the reality of anti-Asian hate. She continues to say, Suni's Olympic medal wins have also sparked the imagination of Hmong people everywhere, particularly girls, that they can walk or flip on their own paths towards the American dream. In closing, I'd like to thank you for your time and dedication to this work. Again, thanks to the fine folks at the Multilingual Learner Conference for having me today, for trusting me with this time with you, and a special thank you to you, the educators who make it your life's work to ensure that the American dream is within reach for all kids. Again, my name is Don Vu, and I know we have a Q&A. You can find me on Twitter at Dr. Don Vu, and my website is www.drdonvu.com. Thank you very much, everyone.